Welcome to Supply Chain's Fivefold Reconciliation in the Conference Track Process Excellence. Dan Zrymiak is our speaker, and he is an ASQ Fellow, has been awarded multiple ASQ medals and certifications. He is also a prolific author and presenter. He has 30 years of professional experience, and personally, I've known Dan for many years, and he's a past member of the QMD Council. A little bit of housekeeping for this session. We're at 45 minutes total. The questions and answers will be at the end of Dan's presentation. Please put all your questions in the chat window. Depending on the number of questions, we may not get a chance to get to all of them, but Dan will have his contact information at the end, and you can reach out to him directly if we don't answer your question. So at this point, over to you, Dan, and thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those overseas. I will share my screen and we can begin. Okay, to confirm, is my screen visible?
Yes, it is. I see it, Dan.
Okay, thank you. All right, so fivefold reconciliations. This is, to summarize what I'd like to accomplish, is to show how with supply chain, we can have success from both the top-down and bottom-up perspective. The success comes from having internal alignment so that arrangements and agreements made at the highest levels are propagated and cascaded through the different phases, the different components, all the way up to payment and renewal. And as well with the bottom up, not everything, we don't have crystal balls, not everything can be anticipated in advance. So we want to strive for internal consistency so that when variations come, they can be addressed, documented, and we reduce the missed opportunities. So the fivefold, this is very generic, intentionally very generic. I'd like this to be applicable to as many industries and types of transactions as available. We have a very broad range of participants in this conference and also who will be viewing this presentation after. So I wanted this to be as relevant as possible. And at the highest levels, we have the approved vendors, a vendor approval process to distinguish who can do business and who can provide goods and services, a category of master agreements so that the range of services and business offerings and products that can be made, the specific transactions, the deliveries from those transactions. So think of this as a continuous cycle of what you're committing to or what the supplier is committing to deliver to you and having those deliveries completed. And then, of course, the payments, making sure that all of these line up. The bias I have is that these would be tracked. I've termed it as an IT system, information technology. Whether you call this something sophisticated like enterprise resource planning, ERP, or material resource planning, or it's just simply shared templates or shared custom databases. However, whatever manner is done, as long as these are tracked and available for reference, that will go a long way to helping to reconcile and ensure both top-down and bottom-up alignment. So the first part, approved vendors. This is very important from a management system perspective. It's a requirement if you have any sort of registration like ISO 9001 or the industry-specific equivalents. So these are the steps to initially qualify and select the vendors who are eligible. And in 2025, we see with other external and political and economic considerations that not all vendors might be eligible due to trade restrictions or other controversies. If a particular vendor is involved in a line of business which your organization finds objectionable, that would prevent them from being an approved vendor. By the same token, their country of origin is extremely important, especially with certain sensitive components or services. So this is the level where these considerations are made. Depending on the strategic importance, that will also determine the extent of which vendors can be approved. And I've had multiple times in my experience where in serving a major company, what might be considered a Fortune 500 or even more exclusive, when you are a tier one supplier, when you're an exclusive supplier, you are actually brought in and given special privileges for access, for documentation, and in turn, your work is viewed as an extension of your customer's work. In the same way with your organization, I've experienced where the key suppliers have been granted access to our internal information technology system for the sharing and updating and cross collaboration of important artifacts and files. So because these come with security risks, accountability, traceability, this approval is very critical to have documented. It's time bound and renewable so that it would be imprudent to give an organization unlimited and indefinite access. It's more important to treat this with specific terms and conditions for renewing. If everything is going well, this can be revisited and renewed with little effort. In contrast, if you've encountered problems with the vendor, the next cycle of approval could be an opportunity to reduce or even remove them as a vendor. Whatever happens, whatever the status is, this should be reflected within the information technology system. Now, this is a foundational level, and it drives the terms and conditions for subsequent information, which I will elaborate. And I use the distinction between references and source of truth. All of that are important, but it's really going back to this relationship. If it's one level above or below, you can see it as a direct reference and you can pinpoint, you can reconcile on a clause by clause or point by point basis. When it's two or more levels removed, it's still valid, it's still a source of truth, but it might not be so easily reconciled because a statement in the approved vendor might be a clause or a paragraph, whereas by the time you get to the transaction level, it could be very specific bullet points and requirements. So that's how I distinguish between the two. The next level is master agreements, and that's a term for if there are multiple transactions or multiple services agreed over a time period, rather than having explicitly detailed items within each individual purchase order that are just going to be redundant and recycled, it might be more efficient to migrate those to a higher level master agreement. This is also important because of who would authorize a master agreement. A master agreement would be an executive level or a functional head could review the terms for how products and services are delivered and prepared. This, by doing this at a higher level, this also entrenches the decision of greater importance. And in organizations, especially as organizations are more structured, there are controls and limits to the level of authority held at each level. So, for example, the CEO might have a very high spending authority, and then it progressively decreases. Vice presidents, department heads, department managers would have incrementally lower agreements. So a master agreement could reflect a range of business at a particular spending level. So it's a scope of services. And again, this master agreement should be referenced and uploaded to the IT system. So ideally should come from the approved vendors, which means that any changes to vendor approval should cascade to master agreements. For example, if there's a change of ownership at the vendor level, the master agreements should be revisited. If there's a scope, for example, let's say you're in the business of doing medical devices. If you have a master agreement with a supplier, they're qualified to do medical devices from the earlier evaluation, but then something happens that they lose that qualification. They're no longer eligible to do things to medical grade, only to an information technology grade. That has to be reflected in the master agreements. And then it turns into you have to revisit the terms and conditions. By having this master agreement, this becomes a reference for the transaction, and that it should reflect upwards to meet the terms and agreements of the master agreements. And the source of truth, when you deliver and you expect payment, there should be also reconciliation back to the spirit and intent expressed in the master agreements. These transactions, this is the bulk of what is done in terms of procurement, and it can range from small purchases to extended delivery programs. In some cases, organizations purchase commodities from, say, major retailers or online marketplaces, and there's very little intervention or modification to what's purchased, especially for things like office consumables. As long as you get what's expected, the transaction should be fulfilled. However, at higher levels of complexity and customization, it's more important to have things detailed in a more explicit manner. Some examples of ways to do that would be statements of work for projects, proposals for, say, construction or infrastructure, purchase orders, if there's a series of items that have to be not just purchased but modified or purchased with particular criteria, and then of course the pricing terms and conditions. Now this should map back to what the approval items are and what the master agreements are, because sometimes these terms and conditions can incorporate discounts. In a past experience, discounts were negotiated. I worked for a global company, and certain vendors negotiated global discounts. However, when transactions were made at the local or regional levels, these discounts were not honored. So it's very important to revisit the terms and conditions so that all of the negotiated savings and the negotiated benefits are reflected. And as well, in the transactions, this is where you might encounter unforeseen issues. So how are these handled? And that's where there should be consistency. And of course, if they're reflected in the IT system, they're readily referenced. And for more specific information, changes in the agreements and changes in the approved vendors should flow down. And okay, a specific example that I've encountered: printed circuit boards. We're in the height of summer. We're in mid to late July. It's as hot as we're going to get in our part of the world. And one of the technical realities is sometimes extreme temperature conditions, so high temperature, could cause portions of a printed circuit board to malfunction for various reasons. This may not have been addressed, this technical limitation may not have been addressed at the vendor level or at the master agreement level, but it's a fact of life. So that should prompt other revisions, for example, change orders, redesign requests, if it's a defect, the defect resolution. And this is very important to do so in the context of the other information, so that not only do you get the technical solution, but you do so within the confines of the business arrangement, or if the business arrangement is not anticipated it, you can make those necessary modifications. The work being done and the changes that come as a result of that work will also affect the deliveries and the payments. So this is a very critical midpoint to this sequence, to this framework. So the deliveries, as I mentioned earlier informally, you don't want to fight the battles at the loading dock. You want, by the time it gets to the loading dock, that you have a clear path of resolution remediation. And with the supply chain, the more complex the product or the more complex the service, the more that you have to manage the involvement of other parties. I've termed these as intermediaries. This could be additional with the supply chain. They might have their own contractors to work with, and the limitations of those contractors have to be considered. For example, you might have a supplier who is based in North America, but their key contractors are offshore, the work is offshored overseas. So that could affect delivery times, availability, especially if there's like a 5-day national holiday during a critical delivery period. Integrators, that's if you have the different components, bringing them together, and integration itself represents a big challenge of in the sense that if a component is not quite compatible, then additional work is needed to address that compatibility without disrupting the whole system. And sometimes that can affect the technical solution, the schedule, the people, the cost of people involved, and making sure that those deliveries are managed and accounted for. Regulatory agencies, if you are in a situation where your product or service has to comply with an international requirement like CE mark, the regulatory agencies do not operate on your schedule. They do not operate with your commercial interests in mind. They simply review the objective evidence and they will approve or reject based on the ability to meet certain criteria. It is incumbent to know what is expected of the regulatory agencies, and it's also necessary to incorporate that you have the correct requirements for the nature of your product, so that you don't unduly delay or you don't inappropriately over test or over deliver. One of the things with regulatory agencies internationally is harmonization, so that if you have a credential in one geographic group, to what extent does that credential help you with other groups? I've experienced this directly where in one part of the world that's adjacent to Europe, they were willing to use the CE mark as meeting about 80% of the criteria. And then we had to do some subsequent confirmations. Managing the intermediaries is very critical. And because that affects cost and schedule and the overall quality, that should be reflected as part of your reconciliation, and that should be documented within your IT system. And then satisfaction or reporting of outstanding issues. If you have critical issues that will affect acceptance, that has to be tracked to the point of when they can be properly resolved to the satisfaction of everyone. So with this, you've got the transactions that have done. This is the completion of those transactions. And that's definition of done and acceptance criteria are two high-level terms to reflect this. Definition of done is nothing will ever be perfect, but what will be suitable. And you have internal minimal viable product. That could be an internal deliverable minimal commercial product. So whatever done means to the client that they're willing to sign off. If it's more specific, the acceptance criteria should be something that it extends beyond just a checklist, because that should be both verification and validation. Verification would be that a checklist of the requirements that they are all met to the satisfaction, but validation represents the extent to which what you've delivered fulfills the expected use in the intended environment. Does it do what it's intended to do? Does it do what the client does? And that can be more subjective and quantitative, both quantitative and qualitative attributes. So you have examples of artifacts, purchase orders, statement of work, proposals that are explicit. That should be tracked. And then based on that, fulfillment of those terms should be confirmed. If any of those are waived, the agreements to waive should also be confirmed by a suitable authority. If this is done at the loading dock, it can be very sloppy. In contrast, when these are addressed at the highest levels, even at the master agreement level, by executives, by decision makers, and then cascade down, they're far more manageable. So also with deliveries, short shipments, products damaged in transit, what's the resolution? And it comes back to whose account it is. That is when these are addressed at the approved vendor or the master agreement level, then you just simply follow the protocol. If they've been overlooked and you have to again address it at the loading dock, then it requires some investigation and it becomes a determination of the business relationship. In procurement and supply chain management, there is a term vendor paper or customer paper. That really represents which organization is imposing their terms of resolution. And again, that is something that ideally should be addressed at the approved vendor level. If the customer sets the term, we will approve you as a vendor if you take ownership uh, of your product condition all the way to our delivery. That's something that should be addressed at the top. Whereas if that's not addressed, the customer would say, we only take ownership once it's shipped, and once it leaves our property, it becomes the problem of the customer. So that's one example that if it could happen, so it should not be an unforeseen issue, but if it's not correctly addressed early at a high enough level, then it can create complexity and conflict at the tactical viewpoints. Over delivery and gold plating. I'll give an example, a personal example. I was at a hotel in Florida. Florida is a lovely place, probably a bit hot this time of year, but very nice during the winter months. And there was a mix-up at the hotel I was staying. So to appease me, I received a room. I was a single traveler. I received a room with a suite and two sets of bedrooms. So to myself, as a sole person, I had access to four beds, three television sets, and two washrooms. I couldn't use them all at once. This is overcapacity, and it seems absurd, but when you think about business, sometimes there are overcapacity deliveries all the time. This is a waste because the company has resources and inventory that they don't need and can't immediately use, and the company has expended um, time, labor, costs to provide these unnecessary items. So it's very important with deliveries, not just to meet the expectations, but to also refine the delivery so that it does not introduce new opportunities for waste and slippage. And again, with deliveries, time bound and status driven. A very key question you don't consider it until you spent some time in a warehouse is when is a product delivered? When is a product received? When is a product approved? Outside of the warehouse, you might think that those are all redundant terms, but that's a very complex thing to manage because when something is delivered, it's placed in a staging area. When it's received, it's tracked in the system. And when it's approved, the person who needs it and uses it can say, yes, I accept this. If it's not approved, then it's pushed back to um, some sort of quarantine or some sort of return to manufacturer process. That is one tactical example of something that, when it's addressed at the tactical level, could again create confusion and conflict. But if it's addressed at a higher level, then it gives an opportunity for more prescribed outcomes. Payments. This is why we're doing this. This is the exchange and financial arrangements or other exchanges to complete the transactions. This is not just the fulfillment, but what keeps things going. Payments are very important for the supplier because they've expended time and effort and resources and provided, and then they want some return. However, if this is delayed, this could potentially disrupt and create conflict for the business arrangement and affect whether the vendor, not just whether they're approved, but if they even want to continue to do business with you. So the terms and conditions, one such thing is the payment terms, the credit terms. If it's cash on demand, if it's net 30 days or net 90 days, this is this should be known. This also is discount, particularly volume discounts. If someone provides not just a product but a service. So, for example, if you have a vendor to manage your funds, and once your funds reach a certain threshold, say $500,000, the management fee reduces from 2% to 1%. It's very important to know this and to ensure this is honored at the time once you become eligible. So it's very important to have this referenced, not just after the fact, but you can even proactively do this to structure that if you make your volumes in advance and plan for them in order to get the discounts, then you could gain a strategic advantage and you can gain additional supply chain savings. That only happens if you have no gaps due to obsolete, outdated, or inconsistent references. Again, this is important that if payments are affected by obsolete reference, then every agreement above should be revisited periodically to make sure that it's still valid. Or if something is going out of date, that a good benefit could be, to use the term grandfathered, it can be extended as part of preserving that business relationship. So, for example, if you have a 40% discount from the price because of the volumes that you order, make sure that that volume is not canceled off January 1st, and then January 1st you're starting at zero again, so you lose that discount. You might want to make sure that that is year over year and not just the calendar year. This seems very obscure, but these are very real negotiation issues with terms and conditions that, if properly managed and properly yielded, could result in additional benefits, and not just benefits at the transactional level, but restoring and reinforcing a very strategic business relationship between the organization and its strategic suppliers. So you have delivery outcomes. Delivery outcomes are not just by what was signed at the highest level, but there's also dynamic influences. I've given some examples of change orders. Change orders, depending on how you've structured them as part of master agreements, should redefine schedule, quantity, price. Anything that's worth changing should be tracked through the completion of that change, so that that is your new scale of acceptance. Force majeure, there used to be other terms, but in my part of the world, sometimes we have unusual storms that take out roads, take out electricity. This is wildfire season, which could affect certain communities. Even if the community itself is not damaged, it diverts attention and resources. So something extreme like that could affect the delivery. That should be tracked, and as a result, the impacts of such force majeure that are immediately recognized both, and that affects deliveries, especially if you have what I call a penalty-driven contract. A penalty-driven contract is a contract where if you are late charges, the or you have quality deficiencies, then the vendor is penalized depending on the extent of those deficiencies until there's a resolution. This is a force majeure, could help to bring some relief if that force majeure is shown to have affected those. But that, again, has to be established and defended in the higher agreements, like the approved vendor agreement, the master agreement. So it's making sure these are negotiated at the executive level so that at the tactical level, they can be activated. And again, payment terms and conditions should be reconciled back to the purchase order. This is at the transactional level, this is typical when invoices must reference the purchase order or the statement of work. Completions, inspection completions reference back to the requirements agreements. And through that, that cascades upwards, because although your counterpart at the customer might be the source of conflict, they in turn have their own levels where they have to justify acceptance, that their acceptance was traceable to getting the proper objective evidence. Our payments, this in turn, I say it's not just in financial, it could be the opportunity for continued business. Sometimes major companies will do a trial, an eligibility project, which if this is, they have confidence on your delivery will enable you to deliver um, products and services of higher complexity or greater criticality. And again, an example would be medical devices of software integrated software products. They might try, first of all, let's give a low risk product to this company, and if they can deliver the low risk, then we will entrust them with products of higher risk, higher clinical importance. So the payments, this phase is really about getting the reward for all of the efforts based on what's been negotiated and based on what's been delivered. So again, referring back to the fivefold reconciliation, the payments should come from successful deliveries, which the deliveries should be the completion of agreed transactions. The transactions are in the scope of whatever master agreements were performed, and master agreements with the approved vendors, so that by having completion at these lower levels, this demonstrates that the approved vendor should remain approved. In contrast, any problems along here reflect badly on the master agreements and approved vendors and should prompt revisiting or redefining the terms, or at the worst case, terminating those arrangements. Ideally, we want to have both top-down and bottom-up consistency. So the benefits of reconciling across these different levels is to establish, monitor, and govern the interaction so that it's governed, fact-based, data-driven. It's not governed by emotion or instinct or improper escalations. It follows the suitable process at the proper levels of authority. Integrated IT system. Capture this information and have it available at the levels, have the appropriate information available at the various levels. So someone in the loading dock does not necessarily need to know what margins are being made from this. They don't need to know necessarily all the insurance, but they need to know information that's suitable for their role. In turn, someone at the senior purchasing or accounting levels do not need to know how many boxes fit on a pallet. They don't need to know those physical logistics, but they should be aware of what's needed for them to make suitable decisions on the prevailing risks and the quality expectations. So yeah, key working details should be readily available and provided. And to add, key working details should be updated based on to reflect any recent changes or agreed upon conditions that would affect the outcomes. So having internal consistency, it minimizes the variations. It allows for addressing, mitigating the risks, resolving the issues, and reducing the missed opportunities for savings, so that on reflection after transactions, it's a good idea to revisit the terms and conditions to see, is there anything that we can refine, find additional savings. So for example, if there's a volume discount that has been far exceeded, could the company be eligible for additional volume discounts? If there's been if in turn if the vendor is providing additional services, is there an opportunity for the vendor to monetize those services? Or in the case of post delivery services, rather than charging straight time materials, is there an opportunity to get on a more structured retainer plan? So lots of opportunities, as long as there's visibility and frequent reviews. And this is something that really a company, by managing the opportunities within their supply chain, that can transform it from being a net expense to a strategic asset. So that's where we're at. And at this point, I'd be delighted to take any questions or elaborate on anything that I've discussed.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to ask a couple.
Please.
Okay, so I I've had a lot of experience with suppliers, so do you have any examples, Dan, of like a master agreement that you might have seen that didn't include the criteria that was needed and there was lots of problems afterwards?
Well, my recent experience, I'll just go to the master agreements of what my recent experience was. The master agreement. We, our company was the supplier, and the company had a very explicit master agreements. There were three levels of legal legal advisors. We at the time we thought it was overkill, but it turned out that by addressing it at the master agreement level, everything else propagated very efficiently, and that it was by following it that the items were prescribed. Um, in turn, we use the same format for our own vendors, and it, along with regular dialogue, was a very good method. What helped was when I didn't mention this during the presentation, but in practice, when you have frequent status and frequent communications and interactions with both your organizations you're serving as a supplier and in turn your critical suppliers, the dialogue when it's referenced back to the terms of the master agreement helps to have a more prescribed solution and agreed resolution of outstanding issues. So to your question, no, I haven't found where a robust master agreement leads to additional problems. What I have found is that not everything from a technical viewpoint, you envision that what you design is going to work as designed, and you don't always and then once that at the first prototype you might encounter some things that were not originally considered. So you have to resolve technical issues, but by doing that within the confines of a master agreement and statement of work, it's more manageable and ultimately more cordial.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Dan. Here's another question. Any suggestions for putting together agreements for blanket purchase orders for services when you might need to identify specific acceptance criteria for service delivery, but may not have a good idea ahead of time of what services may be provided?
There's when I first came into quality in the mid 90s, there was, and I regret I didn't incorporate that into this presentation, but there are five touch points of services. Really, it's about, I think it's the serve qual model, and it's really about expectations management. So with services, it's first of all the scope of services, what's the expertise, and what's the extent of expertise, so that I'll use an example of H&R Block is widely known for tax preparation. That's its predominant, but they're a financial organization. If someone wanted to use H&R Block for, um, personal investment, they may be capable, but that might be a stretch for some of the H&R Block employees who are trained as tax preparation people. So it's very clear with services, what are the expectations of the scope of services, and at what point does the service and expertise end? So setting those boundaries is very important. Um, Reasonable delivery based on the complexity of the service and the capability of the service provider, establishing what should be done so that um, in a individual household tax preparation, that's something that probably could be done within 1 to 3 days. If it's for tax preparation for a major estate with spanning a person who owns multiple businesses, multiple properties, that scope of services would probably be longer. So setting, I'd say to that question, expectations management, scope of services, skill set of the service providers. That should be, this is what we can do. And then the customer say there should be a balance between what the customer needs and what the service provider can perform. If you have alignment, then it's simply, carrying out the transaction. If there's misalignment, then there should be the extent of we can do so much after this point. We'll have to refer to another provider. An example as well is medical. You have your general practitioner who can do general medical, but once it becomes specialized, they would refer you to a specialist. So um, now, for how do you rate prepare a set of services? I think set the expectation. What's the scope, and at what point? What happens when the service has to be escalated? If the service is unsatisfactory, a resolution plan as well. So that should be incorporated into the agreement. If there are claims, if there are um, dissatisfaction, what's the obligation of the service provider? What's the obligation of the organization? So the more clearly that's defined, then that can be more easily resolved. Is that touch on what the question was?
I think so. That was a great summary. Thanks, Dan. One other thing, I know we have time for one more question, and I'll probably ask it because I don't see any
Yeah.
other questions. But have you had any experience with any of the master agreements? Well, there's a criteria that it cannot be counterfeit parts. Have you seen that?
Oh, absolutely. It's because not just big country of origin, um, you know, because the liability of counterfeit parts is extremely critical, and you don't want to pass that liability on. In conjunction with that, the master agreements will also set liability limits so that if you do business, then you take on they won't take on your risks. One specific thing from a past project was also rare earth minerals from certain countries that we had to attest that we did not use any of that, and we did not do business. None of our vendors did business with these particular countries. So uh, and it's very good to definitely have a qualified person review the fine print
Right.
to make sure that your company's not at risk.
Right. Or have someone inspect some of the parts as they come in too. Yeah.
Country of origin is very important, not just because of tariffs, but even in shipments, because
Sure.
there are when they're brought in internationally, there are different penalties and rates that have to be covered. So um, the country of origin of the majority of the product has to be known.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Dan. We're at the end of our time. So I don't see any other questions, but I want to thank you for your time and your expertise. Was wonderful presentation. I want to thank everyone. And if you have any other questions, Dan has his contact information here. Please email him directly, or how about your LinkedIn site as well, Dan?
Yeah,
Okay.
and my ASQ, of course, that's to
Yes.
members. Yeah,
Members at my ASQ. Yes, thank you so much. I enjoyed this very much, and I will post a PDF copy of your slides on the conference site. So thank you. Thanks.